Yeah.
Right. Okay. So it's pretty much 11:05. I think we have a good group of people that have signed in, so we should probably start, so we don't bore those who are just sitting here watching us chit chat. So, I mean, for those who didn't assist our webinar 2 weeks ago, we sort of started off kind of catching up and doing a bit of an introduction to Nulty Bespoke, sort of what we do and our constant desire to sort of test and play and explore. And, a lot of the times doing this either for a particular project or sometimes even before, we even have a project in mind or a project to work on. And it does sort of mean that our team is quite knowledgeable in the field, and given the current situation, we're all indoors. We thought that it would be a good time to sort of put a range of webinars together so that we can essentially focus on a material at one given time and how that works with light. So 2 weeks ago, the first one that we did was on glass. Today will be on ceramic, and we'll have our final webinar in 2 weeks' time, which will be on acrylic. The setup that we have for today is a little bit different than the first one, because we do have Dan Blaker, creative director for Nulty, with us. And we have Al Maxwell, who's a really good friend of Alison's and also a great ceramist, who will also be helping me today. And hopefully, we'll be a great trio. So touching upon sort of ceramic, a lot of the crafts that we tend to work with, you will find that they, date back as far as, for example, with ceramic 24,000 BC. And you will find that a lot of the studios and artists working in the industry at this time will sort of still use the same tools and techniques that were used many, many years ago. And probably with the exception of using 3D technology to sort of, assist with your molds and your masters, it is still very much a craft that upholds its traditions and, its historical ways. We do have quite a huge concentration of sort of manufacturers based in the UK, mainly in Stoke-on-Trent. I think we're quite well known for producing sort of ornaments and pottery and other sort of large-scale production. But funny enough, although some of us might have even played with clay in school at some point, when we started using ceramics at Nulty Bespoke, I still questioned myself a lot on, what ceramics were. And I remember asking this really silly question once to an artist, and now I understand how silly it was. But she looked at me really weirdly because I asked, what's the difference between ceramic and porcelain? So what I thought would be really good is to kind of start off, before we go into sort of, the different techniques available, to just break it down, because I don't know, maybe more people out there who had the same question as I did. And it very much is, ceramics very much, using clay to create sort of solid forms and shapes. And you'll have different types of clay that you can access. You'll have stoneware, earthenware, and porcelain. And even in porcelain, it will break down into, for example, bone china, which in fact, porcelain and bone china are very popular amongst sort of the lighting industry because of its really sort of pure white color, and it does act as a really good diffuser of light. And then you'll have different techniques like hand building and throwing and casting. Hand building is probably the one that some of you might relate a little bit to, because it is a very simple technique, and I'm sure that some of us have, had some experience at school playing with, clay and seeing how it works. And then you have throwing, which is also very similar, but is obviously on a wheel that's constantly turning. When you see sort of videos online of artists kind of creating their ornaments or their vases on you know, on a wheel, you definitely see the level of concentration and technique and sort of control that you kind of require. And then you have casting, which is actually the one that we will be focusing on today, purely because for our lighting installations, where they take like multiple components, slip casting sort of will allow us to guarantee that you have sort of the same finish and consistency for every single unit. So in regards to slip casting, I mean, the experience that we've had with it so far, we tend to, like I said, use 3D technology to print a master. Now, the master is sort of the desired shape that you want, right? But it's a 3D print of it. And from what, you know, we've done in the past, you sort of, your artist will essentially make what I like to call like a plaster footprint of your master. And then that is pretty much your mold that you would use over and over and over again. And slip casting pretty much is you know, pouring in that liquid clay to sort of set and harden. But I've also, you know, I've heard of other ways that you can do this. Elle, what is your experience with slip casting?
Well, I mainly work with slip casting. The model making for me is normally done out of plaster. You can do it on a plaster lathe. And you can sand that down or carve into it, or however you want your final mold to be. Slip casting is just a really, it's just a nice way of being able to reproduce something in still a handmade way in a batch. It's a useful technique for that, and then you can manipulate it afterwards. You can obviously we speak about the ways that we can apply decoration and manipulate the form later. Okay, it's a really good way of getting a base shape and being able to repeat it.
Yeah, and get that consistency. And I think that's why we've obviously used it before, because of trying to get sort of, you know, 300 units sort of consistent and same shape throughout.
Yeah.
We have also, I mean, not that we've tested it ourselves, but I have heard that sometimes, especially today with designers, you know, using new technology to really make, you know, let's say complex designs, that a lot of the molds today are sort of, you know, 2 or 3 part molds, which essentially, although it's great because it will allow us to obviously really work on detailed designs, it really does cause some issues. What are the issues that you've experienced with sort of 2-3 part molds?
It's more complicated to make the mold for it in the first place, or the master mold for it. There's more problems with leakages. How complicated it is. Part of it is that you obviously have all of these parts which need to fit together, but they are essentially blocks of plaster and they won't just grip to each other. So you have to band them together with like slip casting bands, which are big rubber bands, and make sure that it's really secure when you pour your slip in, so that you just don't have a disaster and it just sort of pours out all over your bench. But it's, once you've kind of got the knack down, you know where to put your bands, you know what your technique is and what your system is, then it's again, it's a really good way of producing in a handmade way a form that might be quite complicated.
Yeah, we do tend to find, because I know that we discussed as well, creating quite a unique shape, and where you sort of have like really faceted corners and sharp lines, that sometimes having a 2, 3, 4 part mold can be quite difficult to remove the mold from the slip, because it essentially gets stuck, if I'm right.
Yeah, it can do if there's a lot of seam lines around it, and maybe your mold's kind of been used a few too many times, and it's the slip's starting to kind of move into between the cracks. Then it can, molds have a lifespan. You can often get a couple of 100 casts from a mold, and then you'll need to replace them. Maybe less sometimes, less than that. But yeah, there's different kind of issues, but you get kind of a good feel for the the kind of rhythm of the process when you're doing it, and what you need to do, and what will cause a problem, and you get used to it.
I think for me, it's worthwhile pointing out to sort of my interior designers and some of my clients, because you know, I get asked all the time when we're working on certain sort of concepts. They'll start the concept thinking that they might want to use, I don't know, glass as a material, for example. And then somewhere along, they'll change their mind and they'll say something like, can we maybe opt for acrylic? Or do you have any other suggestions of sort of a different material that in their head they think will probably be a little bit cheaper to work with, sort of more cost effective. And then it kind of a lot of it then comes down to like the tooling required and the molds. And that's, you know, it's a completely different topic, because a lot of the times it's like, well, yeah, for example, acrylic might be sort of a lot more cost effective. However, if we're going to make a design that is quite complicated and requires a lot of tooling, then sort of, you know, your initial costing on those molds is very important to sort of take into consideration. And I think it's just worthwhile pointing out, especially because now in today's sort of design approach, we do tend to sometimes overcomplicate certain designs. And this is really interesting in terms of this slip casting method, that there are issues that can occur, whether that is leaking or whether that's obviously difficulties in removing it. So I think also another, the topic, essentially what really interests us, Nulty Bespoke, is very much how this particular material reacts with light. Because realistically, you know, you're talking about clay. It's very, very solid. And we've also come to realize through testing that we've done that the simplest thing, like a little bit of you know, color to the porcelain, or even the thickness of the wool of your ceramic, can be, you know, can have a huge impact on how much light is going to travel through. So what we are going to focus on the next few slides is very much techniques available to us to be able to use, you know, clay and pair it up with light and sort of get some sort of either a glow or maybe even pattern and washes, depending on sort of what you desire. So we're going to start off with ceramic carving. In fact, this is one of Elle's pieces that she did for us. And we actually, I think we did it for a bit of testing for a project that we were kind of working on, that's still on concept stage. But from what I understand of it, so Al, please feel free to step in. It is very much the process of using sort of sharp tools to cut into the surface of your ceramic, of your clay. And essentially what happens here is, because you're kind of cutting into it, you are making sort of that layer of your clay thinner, and therefore light should be able to travel through it a lot easier, right? At what stage do you do this? At what stage do you sort of start doing, you know, the carving?
Yeah, so you can see on the picture on the left, that's when you do it. So that's it's called greenware. So it's ware that's been made and not fired at all. So it's not when it's freshly made. So it's not wet mud, essentially. It's kind of dried to an it's called a leather hard stage. So it's sort of waxy almost. You can it's really therapeutic to do. You can just carve into it, sort of like butter almost. And it's at that stage when you do the carving, and it's sometimes quite a small window when you do it, because if you do it when it's too soft, you can kind of take too much away and gouge into it. And if you do it when it's too dry, it's really hard to get the tool to kind of go and pierce through the material. But yeah, it's a really good way of using this. It's a good technique to use if you're using light with ceramics, because you've got creative control over how thin you're making the surface, and where you're choosing to make it thinner, and where you're choosing to leave it thicker, and the thinner places will let the light show through more. So it lends itself really nicely to,
I guess also because it's sort of handmade, then even though we have used slip casting to get sort of 300 units to have the same shape, you then actually are applying a texture which is probably going to be slightly different from each one, kind of adding that, you know, that value to a handmade piece, which, I mean, personally, that's what a lot of our clients come to Nulty Bespoke for.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's obviously lovely.
I think the best of both worlds, I think, because you're getting the casting process, which is, I mean, it's not mass production, it's still a handmade piece, and each piece is poured and taken out and trimmed and everything by the maker, but it's a quicker way of reproducing a shape, but then you can bring that handmade aspect back in and really see like the mark of the person that's made it in each individual component as well.
Yeah, of course. Something that we tested when we received your samples, Al, and we were actually really surprised also, is sort of the way that your porcelain will react with light. We sort of started doing this for a project that is still sort of, early stages, where we're kind of creating these really lovely leaves and ceramic, and they're going to be sort of individually suspended. There's quite a few of them, sort of 200 units. And obviously at this point, we're now trying to explore how we're going to incorporate lighting and how, what kind of effects are we going to get? What do we want? Is it sort of decorative only? I mean, a lot of it, yeah, 100%, especially when you're working with porcelain. But if you see in the slide, it's exactly the same object, exactly the same size, but you have a raw porcelain, which is sort of this lovely pure white that when it comes in contact with light, it has a tendency to glow. And then you have a colored porcelain that actually just, I mean, this is an extreme because it's a very dark shade. But I think, even Al, your experience has been with other colors, they've reacted similar to the dark shades, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So as soon as you add a color to the porcelain, it does seem to obscure the light. I think you can still, if you cast very thinly or you carve into it, leaving very thin areas, then you can still get some light through. A pale shade I think you could use it maybe in a nice way as a gradient. If you have multi-component design, then you could have a few paler shades towards one area where you're going to get little or no light through, kind of bleeding into an area where it's full, just plain porcelain, and the light's going to really diffuse nicely through it. The color does really obscure the light. The one on the right it's got black glaze stain in it, so it is close to black, really. So that's
So we didn't do anything.
No.
I mean, obviously, sort of from a lighting standpoint, we know that that sort of black absorbs. It's a terribly unforgiving when it comes to light. But it doesn't really matter what color you use as an additive. It could even be sort of like a light pink or something. If you sort of, as soon as you put that into the raw sort of base mix, it tends to sort of not be as flattering to sort of transparency as say its raw form. Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
it just seems to make it opaque in my experience. I don't cast work that's very thick, but equally, if it's drinkware or something that I've made, then it's not very, very thin either. Maybe if you're using colour in a lighting project, then you'd probably be able to cast more thinly with it, and with the, say, a pale pink shade that you're talking about, you might be able to get some light through it, but in very thin areas if you carved into it. But on the whole, it seems to obscure the light.
I mean, it's not a terribly bad thing, though. I mean, I think sometimes, especially with lighting, we tend to look at considering the use of ceramic or glass. And I think those two things are like, should we make this, pendant or shade out of one of these two things? And I guess it's worthwhile appreciating that glass innately is transparent, and you can sort of add things to it to make it less transparent. And it's almost the opposite for what is ceramic, which is effectively should be considered like a solid that you can encourage more transparency in. And I think it's with the contouring and with the working of the surface to give it change of depth or sort of an increased transparency. Whilst that sort of works well, as you have on the left hand side there with the light coming through the medium in different quantities, that form also would look equally splendid and equally detailed when light's being shone onto the surface, because again, we've encouraged in what is, to a certain extent, a solid. We've encouraged contours and shapes, so it sort of gives it a unique character and presence, both as a sort of shade that we're lighting through, and both as an object we can light onto. So it's almost more sculptural.
Yeah, Yeah, it's got a really nice sculptural quality when it's carved in daylight as well, because of the just subtle kind of shadows and little scallop shapes that you can get with it. But yeah, it's very like soft and kind of chalky almost, and it just gives a completely different aspect when it's lit from the outside, with light being shone onto it as well as from the inside. So I think you could probably incorporate it in both ways.
Typically, the item on the left there, is that the sort of the raw? That's the sort of raw color of the ceramic.
Yeah. Yeah. So depending on what color your light source is from the inside, it generally gives you a pretty warm kind of golden glow. If you had a very white or blue kind of light from the inside, it might show more sort of a yellowy kind of greenish color. But it's on the whole, most lights will just make it really kind of golden. That's its natural sort of glowing color.
Yeah, sort of anything other than that, sort of fighting against the grain a little bit in terms of its pigmentation.
What's that, sorry?
Anything at like a colder color temperature tends to sort of fight against the grain of its natural pigmentation of the ceramic.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I mean, when we tested it, and we didn't post a picture because the camera didn't really do it any justice, but we sort of put the light within the actual tiny little cup, and it really did have a strong, warm glow. Which I think, using as sort of like pendants, lanterns, or even globes could be quite sort of an interesting effect, sort of like an atmosphere setting. Probably wouldn't suggest it as your only lighting in the room, but decorative for sure. Going on to the next technique that we wanted to touch upon, it's called cutout, and I mean, as the name suggests in the images, this is probably sort of the interesting technique that you can use if you really wanted to create maybe, let's say, shadows or washes of light and pattern in sort of, your nearby flat surfaces, or in fact, you wanted to get more out, so sort of the more light output out of your lighting installation. And again, I was just wondering, Al, like, when do you sort of apply this technique? Is it as soon as you kind of just, slip it out of your cast, or?
It'd be the same time as the carving, so leather hard stage when it's unfired. You'd probably, I mean, you can see on the left that it's at that kind of stage where it's slightly kind of soft and waxy almost. That you can score into it and carve through without it cracking and breaking. But equally, it's got the integrity to stand on its shape without kind of slumping and falling over. So yeah, you could, the way she's done it, I think, is score into the piece first to kind of draw out your pattern almost, and then take the tool through all the way, and then you can use sponges to really soften it up. Yeah, it's at that stage.
I mean, I think because I'm sitting here and I can just imagine like having one of my clients sort of wanting to really cut out massive chunks, and because you see it quite a lot sort of with your Moroccan lanterns and that kind of vibe. But I personally would have. I mean, my concern would be how much can you cut off of it before it just completely goes,
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it depends what clay you're using, really, because if you're using porcelain, it looks like maybe the bottom right picture is probably porcelain, and it's got a lot of carving, and it's still managed to keep its shape. I think that would be the challenge if you were going to use porcelain and choose to really cut almost all of it away, so you're left with like a lace porcelain. It's definitely doable, but you probably need to do some testing to make sure that the shape is going to hold its own. Otherwise, alternatively, you could use a different clay, maybe a stoneware or an earthenware or whatever you want, and carve into that, because it doesn't have such a tendency to warp. Like porcelain in the kiln really has a life of its own. It just kind of does what it wants sometimes. So the more kind of fluid you are with the design, the better sometimes, but that's a really nice quality of it. And it depends on the thickness, I suppose, as well. So the bottom right image looks maybe like it's been cast with a certain amount of thickness to it, but then because you've pierced through and made so many holes, it's giving that delicate effect, but it's meaning that the actual body is strong enough to hold up on its own. Yeah.
I mean, but obviously from a lighting standpoint, this is you know, it's a really sort of captivating way to use this medium. The sort of those perforations could go from either just providing a, you know, like a really sort of beautiful window into the piece, as you've got there sort of shown on the upper slide on the top right, where you use a diffuse source, and you just sort of look at creating a sort of an ambient glow within the work. But equally, you could use the same thing with a point source or something more specular to create sort of huge, as Monica said, sort of Moroccan lantern style shadows throughout the piece, and also the environment that the work is in. So, I mean, it really depends on what you're going for in terms of impact and what you're trying to achieve with these, you know, with the features or the light fitting. But some really stunning sort of emotional effects can be achieved simply by changing the light source within what is, you know, effectively the same object. Just a question about the working of this though. Is it ever, you know, can you go backwards at this stage? Is it ever possible to, you know, erase a hole if you put a hole in, or have you got to start all over again? How forgiving is the crafting process?
With porcelain, it's quite unforgiving. You would struggle to repair something. I work with Parian, which is a form of porcelain. Sometimes that can be more forgiving, strangely. It's sort of, it's got a kind of silkiness to the surface that when it's high-fired in the kiln, if there's like a tiny crack somewhere, sometimes it can actually seal itself back up in the high firing, and it's fired over 1200 degrees. But generally speaking, with ceramics in general, if you've got if you kind of go wrong, or you've got a crack or something, it tends to get worse in the kiln. So we want to try and avoid needing to kind of repair if possible. But at the same time, with this technique, it looks like you could be quite free with it, because in these examples there's so many different perforations that if you made one where it wasn't really quite supposed to be, then you could just like manipulate the shape of it and just go with it. And that's what's quite nice about ceramics as well, is that sometimes you just have to let the material guide you, and that sort of makes the outcomes better, I think, if anything.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a bit like, I would imagine it's like colouring in, you know, like I don't mind drawing, but I hate colouring in, and
yeah.
I make this fantastic mould, and then it comes out and I've got to start crafting into it. You know, if I had the knowledge, I could go backwards maybe, I'd be more keen. I think the true craft is in being the strength of your convictions when it comes to actually sort of going in there for the kill with the finishing off.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I know that lighting as well, if we're sort of lighting onto something or through something, it probably wouldn't, there'd be signature marks of, you know, how it's been made. So it's quite honest, earthy material. So it's worthwhile noting with the light.
Yeah, yeah.
Ow.
Hi,
Monica?
Yeah, I lost some audio there. I'm not too sure if that was just me.
Yeah, no, me too. I couldn't hear.
Okay, Monica, no one can hear you, Monica.
I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry. I was saying that we get asked a lot, sort of by our clients, how they can add, you know, washes or projections of patterns in the space, because they really want to sort of create that drama. And you know, it's good to know. I mean, it's easy to do with glass, but it's good to know that we can also do it with sort of ceramic as well. And I think this technique, you know, not only are you then able to get sort of those projections, if obviously this is very much depending on all sorts of things like the light output and the distance between sort of the light output and also the surfaces, but you know, it gives you that advantage to be able to do that. And then also with the actual installation itself, you're adding texture and you're adding pattern. So again, only just increasing you know, the dynamic of the design.
I think that's correct. I mean, one of the things you said there, Monica, you know, does ring true with, you know, lighting of anything really. But when you're playing with shadows, you've got to really be careful about offset. I think that's a good point. You know, the scale of the hole and the size of the space that the fitting is going to be in, and the distance the point source is away from those holes will create a vastly different impression in terms of shadowing. So you can kind of see on those images you've got there, but on the bottom image you've kind of got quite an instant sort of cause and effect. And I think that's probably like that's a daylight probably shining through that, which keeps those sort of rays of light quite parallel, and therefore giving a pretty sort of clear imprint of what that, you know, what that perforation is on the surface in terms of contrast. But yeah, in a space, it could, you know, those forms, those impressions you make on the wider space need to be quite sort of at least considered, that may be tested.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go into the next one. So layering, and in fact, I saw a video this morning that Elle sent me on Margaret O'Rourke, which I believe is the artist who has done the sort of lovely main image that you see on your screen. And sort of the layering, I think it's a really cool, again, technique to use, not only to sort of add, you know, kind of like depth to your actual shape, because what you're essentially doing, from what I've understood, Al, if you know, correct me if I'm wrong, is you kind of start off with you know, a base, a big chunk of clay as per se, and then you're sort of working on it and kind of, you know, creating sort of like a ribbon effect where some pieces might be a little bit slimmer than others maybe, and then you're sort of trying to create layer upon layer where essentially, or for example, on the other picture where you've got on the right hand side, the first one, or even the bottom one with all those little circle discs, maybe you have less layers to start off with, where essentially the light is pretty much traveling through, and you kind of sort of then put layer upon layers where you'll have some areas that will be essentially darker than others. I mean, I think it'd be great sort of mood setting, being quite smart with your material and your light. But how, I mean, I know maybe Al, you might not have sort of done a similar technique before, but how easy is it to kind of manage something like that? Because I can just imagine, you know, this block of clay and then really trying to work into it must take forever.
Are you thinking of the block of clay to be used with the to make like multi components from, sort of thing, or
no, more like on a wheel, for example? You know, when you sort of have like this bit of clay that you're working with, and then.
Or I guess anyway, sort of the base mold before you know the object you get, you know, at that leather hard stage, that, you know, whatever your, you know, raw element is, if it's a petal, if it's you know, an espresso glass, whatever it may be, at that state where you have to sort of like start the work on it and start to manipulate it, is that
daunting sort of point to start the work from?
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be, but it's also really therapeutic to do. And once you've made one mark, that kind of guides you into where the others should be, and you can sort of draw out on the shape from there. I think what's nice about these images is that they all use the porcelain to its best natural kind of characteristics. So it seems that really with all of them, they're kind of letting the porcelain just warp and move, and in the kiln it looks like, I don't know how they've definitely done it, but maybe with the bottom right picture, maybe it's very thin discs cast. I'm not sure about. Maybe they've just rolled out the clay and then let it kind of moved it a bit at that kind of early stage when it's malleable, and then in the kiln it sort of does the work for you. Sometimes it just kind of moves and melts and kind of just undulates, and that's what's really kind of nice when you use it with light, because the points in the shape that are closer to the light source will shine the brightest, and then the light will disperse as the piece moves away from the light source.
There's like a natural gradient, just because of the, you know, just the way the material works with light. There's also that natural sort of through it. I think one of the things that we appreciate most about using it is that sort of duality it has between being a solid and also being a transparent medium, you know, when needed. And you have, as you see strongly in those, you know, the top and the top image and the lower image on the right hand side, there's a sort of firstly there's a sort of quite a natural tactility about it. You can sort of create these almost, as you say, in the kiln it sort of decides what it's doing. You know, it kind of has a life of its own. I think that character and that expression gives it something that isn't necessarily the same as a mass-produced, you know, sort of manufactured item. which I think is one element of its beauty, but also the way that it sort of plays in its layering, both through that single piece and the way the light drops off, but also when you layer them on top of each other, as in that lower right-hand image. It's so elegant, ethereal. It's something that, it looks like the canopy. It's basically like leaves on a tree with the light shining through them. And I think that's a quality that some people, most people, just sort of relate to innately. It's not even a conscious thing how much you're warmed to that by that texture and that layering.
Yeah, it's a really organic material.
Yeah,
and especially when it's so thin. Sorry, go on.
No, sorry. I was going to say for Dan, like in terms of even for the images that we're looking at now, as a lighting designer, what sort of light what kind of light output or color temperature do you think would work best?
Well, I mean, you've got a couple of different things happening already. I mean, each of those objects is sort of best lit in a different way. Strangely enough, that bottom right image, you've actually got sort of a more diffuse, almost sort of overcast sky color, and it seems to be a cooler color temperature that's being used behind those leaves, those petals. As we mentioned before, that sort of the nature of the material is that it warms up light. Strangely, it warms it up. It's in the nature of the material, so it warms it up. But against the cooler background of that bottom right image, which could be akin to the sky or something, that contrast between the cool and the warm of the form actually really sort of gives it an extra layer of depth, because you have the distinction between where it's more or less present. The sort of top right form looks as though it's something, a light source more centralized to the form. As you can see, that it's emanating from the sources of the petals as opposed to around them, giving it that sort of more bud-like, as you've referenced there with the flower, but it's more like a bud-like quality to that. And you probably you'd still use, it doesn't have to be diffused, but you probably would use a diffused, quite high, high-ish intensity source at the center of that. Again, with all of the craft that you guys do at Bespoke, the hardest part really is the magic of concealing, more often than not, the light source and sort of focusing on the lit effect, which in many ways tends to make a form or a sculptural form more elegant, because there's a hidden level of wonder in how that's achieved, and that sort of makes it slightly more interesting and elegant. If you can see the source, then normally we have to consider why and how that looks, and I think that's something that we're very, very talented at. So I think that those images, left and right, are lit in different ways. I think that sort of the top and bottom. I think the one on the left is a different kettle of fish really, because it's a slightly more complicated form. I would imagine the way that's produced, because it's so layered and it looks quite seamless. But in order to get that to sort of glow like that, I think that would just have a central diffused form. I don't think you'd rely too much on. I mean, it could be a single point source or something more intense in the middle there, and that potentially would cast a similar effect to that, maybe some shadows as well, depending on how the light bleeds out. But I don't necessarily think it needs to be in that instance. I think that when there's something of intensity in the middle, can be diffused, just to allow the light to sort of bleed out and complement those contours.
Yeah. Going on to the next one, which is called Grog. This is interesting because, at the beginning, when we first started discussing sort of techniques and the raw porcelain and the colored porcelain, we did sort of say that adding some sort of color to your ceramic piece would potentially, without a doubt, have some sort of impact on the light that would travel through. And, you almost then get the impression, so what, I can't use any color on my porcelain? Which this technique and the one that we're going to touch upon next actually are ways of trying to incorporate a little bit of color. But if you are going to use it sort of for a lighting installation, that you can manipulate the way that you're adding this color to the form to be able to still get some sort of light projection and sort of glow and warmth. So I think from what I've understood of it as well, and from what we've tested in the past, it's very similar to Fritz. Fritz is a technique that we use in glass, in a sense that you essentially have your white porcelain, or your white clay as your main base. and then you just add little, speckles of colored porcelain into the mix. You sort of manipulate it in the way, as you can see in the image there, where I think it's one of yours, Els, if I'm not mistaken, the second image on the right, where you sort of have the color concentrated at the bottom, and then the sort of top half is still a very raw white clay, which when incorporated with light, you will have sort of the light that will glow in the more whiter sort of areas. How else have you used this technique? It's very much just to add a little bit of color.
Well, what else can I just ask a question that I think everyone might be assuming they understand, and I'm not too sure I do. So, so that green element there, that's the grog, yeah?
Which image are you looking at? Sorry.
So, is the grog the sort of the textures? Is it on that left-hand image there? Yeah. Is that when you're sort of there's an absence of material, and then you sort of bring in? How do you get the two components together? So
the grog is a really strange name, but the grog is the basically grit that you're manufacturing yourself. So, or that's how I've done it anyway. So, color the porcelain, dry it out on plaster, crush it down. And then you're in control of that, so you can crush it to end up with big pieces, or you can crush it down to very small pieces, depending on how you want that the particles to be dispersed. And then you have to fire it so that it doesn't then just dissolve back into your slip. And then add it back into your slip and mix it all through, and then you can cast in layers with it. So
you'd have would you have like two molds, for example, for the image that you see? For the second image on the right hand, where you have some kind of vase or something.
In two layers.
Is it two? Would you cast it into 2 layers?
It is in 2 layers, but you do it all in the same mold.
All in the same mold. Okay.
Yeah.
All at the same time. So you sort of pour in your base, pour in the coloured bit.
Yeah. Well, you pour in your grogged layer.
Yeah.
And then you pour. So it's quite. It again is like quite a rhythmic process, and you have to be patient, and you pour that in, you wait for your casting time, and however thick you need it to be, which is probably in the case of lighting, you do it quite thinly, and just enough to kind of be able to maybe sand it back at the end and not lose it, and then you pour that back out, and then you kind of wait for that to dry slightly, you trim it, and then you pour in your plain slip and fill the mold all the way the rest of the way up, or however you're doing it, and then you cast that as usual. So you let that cast for the amount of time that you need it to be for the thickness, and then you pour it back out again, and then at the end you're left with these 2 layers, and you can fire it once and then sand it back if you want a nice kind of flush, smooth finish afterwards. It's kind of got a kind of cut granite effect sometimes, especially when it's sanded and polished, but it's a good technique if you want to incorporate color, because you're completely in control. So there's endless amounts of color that you can use to create the grog in the first place, and then add that back in. And you could do it the other way around if you wanted to, and color the base porcelain and leave the grog white.
Yeah.
So you could do it that way around if you want to. Obviously, like we spoke about, the light won't diffuse through the colored porcelain,
but it will diffuse through the white. So they'll be sort of like tiny little,
like a galaxy sort of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's sort of, there's a really nice element of surprise when you cast this way as well, because you don't know where the pieces are going to kind of land, and then you can take it out of the mold, and once you kind of sponge back, you reveal where all these little pieces have landed in your mold, and you might have kind of clusters, like a constellation almost. And kind of
like a knowing plan surprise, not a complete surprise.
A good surprise,
a good surprise, a pleasant surprise. Yeah, I knew that. I knew something magical was going to happen. That kind of surprise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I'm going to use that as my selling point now.
Advantage we have with this over that sort of process where we mentioned at the start with the editing of the addition of dyes and colors to sometimes obscures the light. I think there's a nice amount of sort of personalization that this can bring in terms of color to something, to make it so that it can either complement the space better in terms of interior design, or you can make within one feature, you can have a color vein that sort of goes through it, that sort of is just based on overall composition that you just think looks pleasing. But that sort of tailoring of it, I think, is a really nice element to it.
Yeah. Well, next one that I'm going to move on to, I personally really like it. And I really like it because obviously given the nature of my work, and I'm always sort of first point of contact for my clients, you know, I get sort of asked in to come and look at the original concepts and the first stages of design development. And the amount of requests that we get to work with, you know, sort of alabaster and create globes, it's insane. It's a very popular request, and frankly, it's a really hard material to work with, especially if you're now trying to sort of create a globe with it. So sometimes when we get sort of requests like this, or even because there might be sort of issues with their budget, or even, you know, alabaster is a very heavy material, and if there's sort of seating restrictions that it basically means that you can't use that material. We'll look into stuff like using glass globes, but there are certain techniques that we can do where we'll add color into your translucent base, sort of like maybe whites and sands, and the way that it bleeds into the glass, it actually creates a very similar alabaster effect. And, you know, looking at marbling, it's amazing how you can also do quite a similar thing. I don't really know how that's, I mean, I can see that you sort of inject bits of color, and then you sort of just mix it in and let it swirl and do its natural thing.
Yeah, you can color a body of slip to the color that you want it to come out in the end. So the thing with when you color ceramic is that the pigments are often really strong, and if you want, say, a blue, then you don't need very much at all, and in the beginning stages it's going to look really kind of vivid. But say you're doing like a 5% blue in your clay, then you're going to be colouring it. By the time it's combined, it's quite pale, but then when you fire it up to the high temperature, it brings back the vividness. Suddenly it's crazy. It just kind of pops again, and you open the kiln and it's so bright again. But you can be really subtle with this technique, especially if you were after a kind of alabaster finish. These ones are obviously all black and white. You could use a kind of orange or a peachy tones and things that really complement the base ceramic as well. You could kind of, there's endless possibilities with it.
I mean, I personally love this because it's kind of, you know, it's kind of got like an astronomy sort of layer to it. You know, it kind of looks like the sort of gaseous movement or fluid dynamics of a planet or something like that, with the way these sort of pigments and dyes organically move around. I would guess this is one of those examples of a pleasant surprise that you sort of discussed, because you can't really, to a certain extent, curate the pattern that you get. You just sort of, you try and inform it, and then with the colors and with how much you sort of agitate it, and then to a certain extent, the rest of it's in the hands of the gods.
Yeah.
The question I have, because I you know, especially with that form, that orb on the, you know, the sphere on the bottom right hand side, is that whilst they do make fantastic sort of interesting patterns and shapes, how transparent would that be, or how thin would you be able to cast, say a wreath of 300 mil ball? Would it basically, to have a sphere of any sort of scale, would it have to be too thick to sort of let light shine through, or would we have to sort of, what are the considerations to have in terms of lighting?
I'd say you can cast very thinly. You could cast it to be 3 mil thick potentially. Or maybe less. It sort of depends on how structurally strong you need it to be, or how kind of out of reach of other things it's going to be in an installation, and how safe that would be, and etc. But yeah, you can cast very thinly, and it lets the light through in a really golden way.
Yeah, I mean, I was asking because I haven't actually seen many light fittings, and I know that, you know, Bespoke themselves haven't sort of touched this, this method on any of their fittings thus far. And I'm sort of, the more I see it, the more fond I become. So it'd be nice to investigate, but I just want to make sure, because I haven't seen many light fittings out there with this sort of marbling effect on them. And it'd be quite nice to sort of proceed with in some state. Yeah. So I just thought it worthwhile asking to make sure that it was
I also have a question, and I don't know if this is going to sound silly, but like if you are to do a globe with sort of the marbling effect, and essentially, you know, like you said, is it 3 mil thick?
Yeah.
How, and obviously you put your light source in the center of the globe, whatever that would be, if it's sort of, you know, classic E27, or if we're actually looking at some kind of LED engine. But how does ceramic work, or how does it react with heat? I mean, I'm just imagining if it was like on for
ceramic, a fantastic insulator actually. So I think it's not, you know, I think it's pretty good in terms of heat.
Okay. Because obviously we have with the composition, some of the installations that we do, especially if they're hospitality, you have these turned on for like, you know, 24/7 pretty much. So it is just, you know, interesting kind of aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that, you know, a consideration all the while, especially if it's something that's on a low level, you know, fixture or fitting, is the sort of tactility of it. And if you were to sort of go and interrogate it and touch it, you know, what is that? You know, what does that feel like? Less of an issue really when you've got things sort of suspended 4 meters up in the space, because, you know, you can never really interrogate it in quite the same way. And so, yeah, it is important to consider in sort of in some instances, but
yeah.
It's kind of like, I always find that there's a little bit of a, where you've got ceramic and you could have other mediums used, ceramic's got a certain tactility. So you could, for instance, use a resin instead of a ceramic to achieve some effects that look similar perhaps. But there's a different tactility to both of those mediums. And I think the stone sort of content gives this like a more based, you know, as soon as you touch it, you know what it is just by its, you know, your innate understanding of how the heat works with your touch. And it's a little bit like the difference between, I guess, acrylic and glass. As soon as you sort of touch glass, you know, the first thing you do, if it's like a newel post or some sort of glow, if you touch, you can tell instantly pretty much whether or not it's you know, sort of a polymer-based material or a sort of silicon one, the glass. But when it's on high level and you haven't got that level of interrogation, the amount of times as a lighting designer, I've really wanted things to be glass, and then for whatever reason, safety or in terms of glow, for instance, safety and weight and those kind of things, cost. You sort of, it ends up being you know, like an acrylic sphere or whatever that may be. And almost to my disappointment, you can't actually tell too much. so I sort of lose the argument. But I think for me, one of the things is I really want to look. What I like about this material is I really want to touch it, you know, and interrogate it. And so I think, therefore, you know, how it works with the light source is important to make sure that, you know, almost that you can do that, because everyone will want to. I'd certainly want to touch that sphere on the bottom right. If it was if it was a table lamp, I'll be up there to touch it straight away.
Yeah, it's very, very beautiful for sure. Going into sort of the next topic, that's going to be sort of more on like final touches and final finishes that you can apply, not only to sort of add texture and color, but really, I think a lot of these options, like the use of metallic colors and glazing, is just to kind of enhance your ceramic even more when in contact with light. And obviously your graphic transfers, they're quite useful, again, especially because we do so many, you know, high units of the one same thing. To kind of just, you know, it's almost like a tattoo, it's a transfer, and it kind of saves on the time and the you know, the hand labor of sort of having to apply the pattern by hand. So that's great. And obviously in the image that we have, it's sort of using some dark tones, which again, using against your white pure ceramic, you're sort of creating a bit of a contrast and maybe a bit of a silhouette. But if you're using it in metallic tones, whether those are in graphic transfers or just hand applied, I personally really like the way that metallic finishes and details work in ceramic, and also in you know, in other materials. You do find that a lot of the interior schemes that we work with, there are a lot of tones of sort of metal finishes, and metallic colors do have sort of this beauty about them that they kind of just glister in, you know, once the light comes in contact. And I think it's interesting to sort of highlight, maybe Daniel have your own view on this. Like when we have done installations or concepts where we're thinking of, for example, I'm going back to the one that I've already mentioned. It's a project in Belgium where we are making these like sort of lovely leaves, and they're relatively sort of flat, thin petal shapes, and adding sort of like this detail of gold lusters to the surface. In terms of getting light to work with it in a really good way, you would essentially light onto it rather than incorporating the light within the actual fitting itself, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of giving yourself another element to sort of work with in terms of reflection and accent. I think one of the things that obviously gold accent and leafing and silver leafing and things like that is it makes it more decadent, as well as warming up the light source. Plus, with a lot of, I mean, one of the beauties about ceramic and using it, especially in large, sort of anything sort of sculptural, that appears to be quite heavy in terms of its form. You can make ceramic appear quite weightless and quite elegant. And I think that sort of juxtaposition between its physical mass over that which of glass, which seems transparent, so it's naturally lighter, but you can make this solid object become really sort of light. As in its weightlessness, instead of just as well as its sort of color, and I think to that effect, the addition of accents and additional tones just bring out a bit more sparkle and a bit more luster. And I think that's just nice in certain instances. Sometimes it's not required, but it does help to bring a warmth to it. And when more often than not, the forms that we tend to look at as lighting designers, you're looking to create a centerpiece. It's meant to be a moment that sort of celebrates the space as much as possible, and it is meant to be it is meant to draw your eye towards it and become something of wonder. So I think obviously you can have too many accents. I think sort of Coco Chanel sort of famously said, "Take the last accessory you put on, take that last one off before you go out." You shouldn't overdo it in terms of accessorizing, but I think always a little bit of a lovely touch or a lovely twist is always going to bring something more interest.
Yeah, and I think obviously with a lot of the concepts that we work on and sort of the projects, they are key features. A lot of the times sort of going down a staircase or lobby entrances. And I mean, thinking on the concepts that we've worked on and that we've used ceramic, it has always been very much this sort of soft, delicate, feminine material that we make really, really lovely shapes and forms with. And then sort of adding, whether that is, your gold leaf, a little bit of the glazing, kind of just really enhances that material more, because ultimately your eye is going to be drawn to it even more, and it picks up on sort of the shine and the sparkle once sort of light is kind of projected onto these materials. I think it's worthwhile sort of highlighting, because again, this is just coming from experience. I do get a lot of requests of wanting this main decorative feature to also be functional, right? Because it's the only lighting they're getting in that particular staircase or, lobby entrance. And although, for example, with glass and acrylic, we can, incorporate the right sort of light output to be able to make this also, a functional feature. With ceramic, you need the support, I would say, of external architectural lighting, which I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, yes, for my lightings, as a lighting designer, there's two types of feature light that tend to exist. Some of them actually produce a useful amount of light, and some of them don't. And I think the ones that don't, more often than not, have more freedom in sort of how they are more liberated in terms of their performance and how they can look as a result of that. So they can become far more sort of sculptural. But you just have to make sure that there's a supporting amount of light within the space to allow for them to just the feature just becomes something in its own right. Whether it is internally illuminated, it might have lighting within it, but it might not provide the lion's share of the light for a space. And I think that discussion, it's important to have that discussion or that consideration earlier on. I mean, it's a shame sometimes to have to make something that if you design a feature that has fantastic composition and has just the right amount of light in it, it is a shame sometimes to sort of bolt on as much light as needed to sort of bolster the light levels in the space. So I think that, you know, that appraisal by us as designers and by a conversation with the client is important. I don't really want to use this adage, but I think it's, you know, sometimes it's better to have, you know, a separate washer and a dryer than a combined washer dryer, because if you have a combined washer dryer, it doesn't tend to do either one of those jobs terribly well. So I think if it needs to be separated because it just means the best for the form, I think they should be separated. Yeah.
We are going to move on to the next slides, and actually these are just images of projects that some of them we've worked on ourselves. I think this one here, in fact, was a Nulty project. Dan Blake, you should know it quite well, and some are just other projects that we've sort of come across and that we quite admire. But the idea is very much to give you guys examples of how you can use ceramic and then sort of incorporate the lighting. Dan Blake, could you tell us a little bit more about this one?
Well, this is a Spring restaurant. It's in Somerset House. It's just sort of by Waterloo Bridge in London. A place that is a distant memory now. Me being sort of not living in London, I live in Brighton. But it's by an artist, Valeria, and she has basically used ceramic, a very lightweight ceramic petal, or ceramic in this form petals, to replicate that of blossom. And throughout the restaurant, they're sort of animated around the walls of the space. And I think it's quite important to combine the right types of light source to complement whatever sort of feature or decorative form there is. And sometimes that's a diffuse light, and sometimes it's directional. And within the restaurant, there's quite a lot of diffuse light, and that would cast what is quite a flat light onto these sort of more sculptural three-dimensional elements on the wall. So in order to animate them slightly further, we decided to sort of have dedicated spotlights onto them in order to pick out the contours, textures, tones, and make sure that where we've got those fantastic folds and pleats, that we not only cast shadow on the wall, but we pick up distinct, you know, the actual the three-dimensional contours on the piece themselves with a directional spotlight, really expressing them. It would be a shame to lose them. They're so delicate that you almost have to work harder to sort of get them to really sort of pop out, because they're stunning but need to be emphasized.
Yeah. The next one that we have here, in fact, I had to stare at this picture really hard because I completely missed that the main chandelier, which, you know, when you first look at, I mean, I had no idea that that was ceramic. So this is a perfect example to show, because you have sort of this lovely main center chandelier that is sitting there, and actually is really thin ceramic shapes that are sort of, you know, just attached to a metal structure, and you have your light source within. But the way that they glow, you know, it kind of goes back to sort of the conversation that we had earlier on in regards to making the layer, the thickness of your ceramic wall quite thin to be able to sort of let the light travel through. But that's a great example of how it does have a lovely warm light, and that the ceramic material in itself will have the tendency, if kept obviously white, has a tendency to do this. So there's another example again by.
It's worth saying that last piece there, it sort of has a sort of beautiful simplicity to it, but at the same time it offers a sort of fantastic level of tones of light. I think it's sort of sheet really of ceramic that are sort of hung in a sort of tiered classical candelabra kind of way, one over the other, so that between them you have a sort of spill of light passing down between each layer, but also the play of transparency between them. I think you don't have to work in sort of my experience, you don't have to work terribly hard with the material to achieve some fantastic effects. It's more about considering how it works with the light, and through some very simple means you can achieve some stunning effects.
Yeah, you can achieve that maybe as well by casting or rolling your clay out in thicker or thinner pieces as well. So you could vary, if you had multi-components in a design, then you could vary the thickness or thinness of each component, and say split it into thirds, 3 that are 4 mil, 3 that are 3, to like, you know, 1 that's 1.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah, it just like varies the amount of light that comes through it, or you can layer it up in silhouette behind, showing the piece behind is kind of obscuring the one in front, sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, if there's a value engineering exercise, what you can do is you can put a mirror in the back of the, you know, room, and then you get 2 of the light fittings. So
yeah,
it's just worth,
yeah.
I'm trying to encourage people to specify more ceramics, because, you know, for a clever use of mirroring, we can get more. It's value engineered.
Yeah, I mean, we do it a lot as well with sort of the ceiling plates, especially if they're very large. We'll sort of mirror polish them so that when you look up, you kind of get the reflection of, you know, the chandelier below. So yeah, and everyone loves a good illusion. So onto the next one. We also really liked this image that we found, and again, very similar concept, and it really just proves, you know, that the whole discussion that we've had about incorporating the light within your ceramic form, your ceramic piece, and the warm white, sort of the warm glow that it provides. And in fact, in this sort of setting, because it's sort of quite dark and moody, the amount of pendants that we have suspended really does create sort of like this kind of, I'd say, mysterious atmosphere. But I do, you know, I don't know what sort of light source they've used. What would you think, Dan? I think it looks like it might have a lamp holder.
It looks like it's a little capsule, like a G9 or something in each of these, or, you know, maybe 4. But it's, you know, I think it's one of those things, especially for like a more sort of subdued, sophisticated dining environment. You don't sort of, moreover, terribly want fitting to have, you know, too much light coming out of it, because it'll be distracting. So it's a presence of light, you know, akin to, you know, even a couple of candles or a candle. So I think one thing that Bocce do well is sort of a more composite look when it comes to their sort of product, and it always works quite well on mass. I think these are really elegant because, as we've mentioned before, these sort of tend to look a little bit like napkins, which tie in quite well with, or almost like a couple of Chinese lanterns and napkins. So as well as casting a really lovely, warm, flattering light, because the ceramic's giving you that innate warmth that, you know, perhaps a warmer source like a candle would do. They also have sort of a connotation in this instance to sort of the dining environment. Maybe polarize you. You know, it could perhaps look a little bit like a disobedient sort of
napkins rebelling at dinner table.
Yeah, exactly. The table that is never set because, you know, the napkins are being too naughty. But it looks it's quite stunning in terms of its lit effect, and very soft.
Yeah, 100%.
I think the thing sorry, about the last one is they don't, ceramic generally, if it's cast quite thinly, and especially if it's in a lot of different parts, it doesn't weigh very much. So you can often suspend it and give it that really nice floating kind of soft sculptural ethereal sort of feel without having to necessarily have a lot of structure holding it up as you do with a heavier material. So it's useful like that, because they've sort of let it hang in its natural way, and they've sort of spun round, and it's the same shape repeated, but it's working so nicely because it's just left to be sort of free, and it's just hung freely to kind of move as it wants to.
Yeah,
it looks kind of like, you know, a wafer thin pastry, I think, in this context as well.
Yeah.
It's always synonymous with, you know, a high quality of skill, you know, the perfect sort of pastry, the perfect baking. So there's definitely a wonder to this, but I think you can see that in its transparency, where there's sort of the fold is sort of pinched together. You can see that that's, you know, double the thickness, and it's, you know, you're playing the light in a different way, as well as the seam around the bottom, where I think there must be some slightly sort of more robust rim detail around that, because it's slightly darker. So where the light sort of plays with the thickness of the medium, it's almost like a little bit of an X-ray into how it's been produced, and a bit more sort of a bit more story, I guess. You can see more. It's an honesty to it that I really love, because it shows you how it was made.
No, I agree. So to kind of sort of finish off, and you know, we did the same thing with the lighting, the glass webinar that we did, which very much is kind of just touching upon, you know, using the right materials, and depending on whether you are trying to achieve sort of a warm glow, or for example, you want to use the cutout technique to be able to kind of get some sort of wash of pattern and projection on the nearby flat surfaces, to the very last few touches of adding sort of a gold leaf or, you know, metallic tones to detailing, so that you're sort of enhancing even more your material with light. And then again, picking sort of your right light source. We kind of sort of touched upon whether we incorporate lighting within the actual ceramic piece, which essentially, if you know, it's a raw clay, that you are going to get this sort of really lovely warm glow, or if, you know, the idea is just to sort of project onto, so that you either pick up sort of your tones of metallic you know, finishes, or whether you then are going to sort of be able to get your projection of washes of pattern on flat surfaces. So it kind of just, you know, resumes everything that we've discussed, and kind of the daily life of Nulty and Nulty Bespoke when working with materials and trying to figure out sort of the desired mood or effects required in the space, and using light in order to achieve that. What I'm going to do next, I'm actually just going to show the last page of the presentation, because we've sort of referenced quite a few other individuals on some of our images. And also there are all of sort of our social media platforms that you can go and check out. But we also have a video that I'm going to play in the background. And now this video is of Elle, sort of, you know, her working and her sort of kind of showing the procedures of everything that we've kind of discussed. But while that video is playing, obviously Al and Dan and I will still be here. So feel free to ask some questions, and we'll sort of, you know, answer to our best ability. So I'm just going to finish the slideshow, and I am going to put on the video. So start, play. Hopefully it'll load. Can you guys all see that?
I can see it, yep.
Amazing. Great. So yeah, guys, the chat's opened. Don't be shy. Feel free to ask a few questions. We'll stay
safe, everyone. Stay safe.
Yeah.
Oh, but Elle, if you see something during the video that you think requires explanation or some sort of narrative, then feel free to jump in. I won't be able to do the same because I have very limited knowledge of manufacturing. Yeah.
This is the grog being added to the slip. So I'm casting a layer of the grog material first, which this will be a lampshade in the end, and so this will be the grogged kind of section around the bottom that you can see.
You can hardly see the like speckled clay, the speckled color in it when you're mixing it.
Yeah, I know. Sometimes I'm mixing it and thinking there's just not enough in there.
Yeah, very, very light.
But it's very like opaque and kind of chalky in the beginning, and it just transforms so much once it's fired and in its final stage.
Have you ever dropped one of those buckets on you?
I've dropped a mold in the bucket before. And that's annoying because the slip just sticks to the mold, so then your whole mold is covered in slip. So this
is nice sort of manufacturing processes where you sort of come away, it doesn't matter how dirty you get in terms of, spilling on yourself or something like that. It's quite a nice byproduct. Like my granddad was a carpenter as a kid growing up, and he always had wood chippings and things all over him. But there's something about it that's really sort of quite it's part of it. It's part of the craft, and I love that sort of look.
Yeah.
I like so
at the end, but it's just I'm so used to just having a huge apron on and just wiping my hands on it, that sometimes if I haven't got it on, I forget and just wipe them straight.
Like baking.
Sorry?
Like baking.
Yeah, basically. There's a lot like baking in a lot of ways. So this is after it's been biscuit fired, which is the first firing. It takes it to a stage where it's permanent, so it's not going to wash away. And then you can sand back that grogged layer if you like, and it will reveal the kind of granite effect. And then this is it going in for a second firing.
So
yeah, sorry, no, Monica, you take it.
I was going to say, Trevor Morgan has asked, how long does it take before you can remove the piece out of the plaster mold? And I think we've already sort of touched upon this, that it very much depends on the thickness. Is that right?
Yeah. So you first pour it in, and then it takes a certain amount of time to cast, which might be 10 minutes if you want it to be fairly thin. And then you pour it out, and then after that it needs to just basically the plaster draws the water out of the slip, and it gradually just shrinks down into a size that is just smaller than the mold, and then you can pop it out of the mold, and that probably takes a couple of hours. Depends how wet your mold is when you start. If you've been repeatedly using the same mold over and over again, it'll get so it's quite wet, and then it's harder to remove your piece from the mold. But yeah, most of the time, and you should try and let them dry out a little bit in between, really. Yeah.
Okay.
Put out, yeah.
Does anyone have any other questions? If not, then give her a few minutes and we can probably say goodbye to our lovely audience. I hope it was a good session, that everyone enjoyed it, that we didn't go on for too long.
Thank you, Elle, for your time as well. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Oh,
yeah, I've definitely learned a lot, for sure. It's been crazy how much we've had to sort of take in quite a short period of notice. But.
Yeah, me too, from your perspective as well. It's really interesting for me. So yeah.
But the questions that I get asked regularly by my clients, yeah. Okay, so we do have a question from Luke. Does ceramic will it get long-term effects on light? And speaking in terms of color changing, yeah, preserve the colors, temperature. Okay, right. So we also kind of spoke about this because, well, I asked a question, didn't I? Like, how if we were to make a ceramic globe and you know, is in the hospitality lobby, for example, and it's turned on 24/7, you know, how does that react? How does the ceramic as a material react with light and the warmth and the heat? And I think Dan Blaker had answered this. What was your answer, Blaker?
Well, it tends to, I mean, I think as with, there's a, you know, it depends on the light source itself. I mean, a light source, depending on what it is going to more or less be stable. You know, if you're using LED, then it's going to pretty much hold its color for, you know, as a source in terms of color temperature for a long time, without sort of fading off or changing parts of its spectrum. But it will, it'll always sort of work with the ceramic to warm it up. So I think you've really got to consider whether or not you're trying to create a contrast between a cooler color temperature and the light that either is passing through the ceramic or around it. But on the whole, I think the ceramic is going to sort of hold its color. It's going to become stable. So it won't fade or anything like that. So I think it's in the combination between, you know, modern light sources and the material of the ceramic itself, it's going to remain true to form. It'll last a long time in terms of.
And I mean, also there will be stuff like heat sinks and so on that, you know, you'd essentially want to apply as well to ensure that, you know, nothing is sort of like overheating.
Yeah, and always the light source is going to have to be considered. You know, is always, you know, whatever you're using. If you're using a sort of off-the-shelf lamp, then that's already going to be factored in. So if you're using like a retrofit E27 or G9 lamp or whatever, that won't be such an issue. But if you're using sort of a more tailored LED sort of board to achieve a certain effect with the pendant as a luminaire, so you're sort of effectively making that feature more of its own luminaire with a light source integral. Yeah, you'd need to consider its sort of the thermal issues and try and find a way to make everything as discreet as possible. That can be done a number of ways. It can be done with sort of how hard you make that light source work. You know, you can sort of make it work far less hard and therefore require much less heat sinking, and it's more about the sculptural form. But that would just ensure that the LED lasts, you know, for many, many, many years. Especially as also with a lot of feature lighting, you tend to not have it sort of maximum output all the time. You can sort of, it elongates its life tenfold by. I think I sort of, I know this isn't strictly maths, but if you were to dim a light source down by sort of 10%, it'll almost double the amount of light that you can get out of it. So it's worthwhile not sort of pushing light sources to their nth degree, no matter what. It doesn't matter what that light source is, LED or anything else, but it's sort of an exponential curve in terms of longevity at the source. So it's many tricks you can do to make sure it stays giving off the same color all its life.
I think maybe with ceramic as well, in the same way as glass, it's in its final form when it comes out of the kiln, and it's survived temperatures of maybe up to 1300 degrees anyway. So it is that in that state, and the same with glass, in that it's heated up and it's in the kiln to cool down. That's its natural state. And even if you add colour into it, the colour becomes part of the body of the ceramic. So it's not coloured in like a decorative kind of external way, and maybe other materials could be, say, in a cold form, say plastics or papers or anything where light's going to really affect the surface.
Yeah, it's like, for example, acrylic. We've had a few requests for really, really large installations, almost like sort of like wall arts, and in really hot countries like the Middle East, and we've had to sort of consider the sort of light exposure of the natural sunlight, for example, and how long will it take sort of for it to yellow. But considering how the process of making ceramic, and the fact that it does go into these kilns that are extremely hot, then I guess you'd presume that even if it was used in an external
yeah, I mean, I think it is UV stable, because it fundamentally it's its own. So I think it tends to weather. It weathers quite well. I mean,
it's got a permanence to it.
Weatherproof to be used outside. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my email in the chat, just in case anyone wants to actually send me, a separate. Who wants to send through questions or anything of the sort. I know it can be sometimes overwhelming to sort of ask questions live on the chat. So guys, if any of you that are still on do have any questions or would like to, just find out a little bit more, then do email me. And I hope to see you all, I guess, in 2 weeks' time, where we touch upon acrylic. Obviously, it'll be a different setup again. Hopefully we'll be able to get an artist on board. But yeah, looking forward to see you guys in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you.
Love all. Take care. Bye.